Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and welcome back to my tier list for the 0% Growths playthrough of Fire Emblem Vision Quest. As a reminder, this is not meant to reflect units quality in vanilla play. Things are different in Zero Growths, and I do not think that it is necessarily super valuable for how a unit performs in standard play. It does show the baseline of what units can do at base, which can be helpful for vanilla evaluation. However, I think that oftentimes people take it too far, simply because a lot of units who are good in Zero Growths are only good in Zero Growths because you lack other options. Additionally, this is a normal mode Zero Growths playthrough, so there are some units who hit benchmarks at base that they wouldn't in hard mode, and that is worth keeping in mind. Before we dive into the slew of new units, we've got an entire row of new units. Before we dive into that, I do want to adjust the people we have based on how their performance has changed, because they are currently listed in the way that they performed in Part 1. And now that Part 2 has happened, this is an evaluation of both Part 1 and Part 2 combined. So, first thing is first, Onisim, I love you, but he moves down. He's F tier. He's just a generic staffer, and then you get, like, several other better ones. Yeah, it's unfortunate for him, but he's definitely moves down. I think that there's a possibility Lara stays in D. She contributed a little bit in Part 1. Honestly, I think overall, I think she goes down to... I'm comfortable leaving her here. It's a tiny bit of contributions. Just the amount of the game that's gone by. It's still not a bunch. Yeah, I'm comfortable leaving here for now. Bosco, unfortunately, moves down, but I think he is still an A-tier performance. He was really good in Part 1, and then he was good for a few maps in Part 2, despite not even getting a promotion. If I'd sealed him, he'd probably be even better. Hankulani, I anticipated more from her. I think that being the first flyer, doing some of that stuff, earns her C tier. Marlin goes down to D, I think, though. Just less of the game that he's actually done stuff in. He was basically just a few chapters of Brother Sword. Nazar also goes down. Ottilie, I think, goes down to F. She did one thieving thing, and could have done a couple of others, but... Zoya goes down, I think, as well. Yeah, and Lara definitely contributed more than Zoya, so I'm comfortable leaving her here. Esfer, I think, goes down to A. She probably contributed as much as Bosco did. And Larissa, I think, also goes down to A. She was just very important in that early portion. Everything up until 7XX, which, granted, is a smaller portion of the game than it was previously, but I do think that... those contributions are, at least at this point in time, probably still worth an A tier. Yeah, I mean, if Bosco... Maybe she's lower than Bosco. Actually, maybe she's B tier. I don't think it's a tier difference. I think she does less than Bosco, but I don't think it's a tier difference. As for the people who are moved... Oh, and Dewey, I think, goes down to B-ish. I think Gunner also. Actually, I think Gunner can stay, but Vageless can go down. Just again, by percentages, the amount of the game that he's contributed to has gone down. The people I've moved down, I think, are relatively going to stay where they're at. Simply because, yes, it will be an even smaller portion of the game that they contributed once Part 4 happens. I'm not counting Part 3 against any of the people in Storch's army. I guess I should clarify that. Since this game has an army split, I consider availability to be availability within the army you're in, right? So it's to me, very similar to Generation 1 and Generation 2 of Fire Emblem 4. I think it's fairly common that people don't penalize Sigurd for missing chapters 6 through Endgame, and don't penalize Seliph for missing chapters 1 through 5. Like, those are units who are considered to have perfect availability. So, on the same vein, I consider Storch to have perfect availability, and I consider Waluyo to have perfect availability. It is a little bit more complicated, because in this game, the armies do combine, whereas that isn't the case in FE4. But I think of Radiant Dawn in the same way, with Ike's army and Micaiah's army specifically, where I count Ike and Micaiah as having perfect availability for their armies. Speaking of Storch, though, I do think Storch moves down. He was still surprisingly competent for longer than expected, but I think that he's here. The Riz is nice, though. The massive Riz is quite nice. Yeah, and I think, honestly, I think Osane stays in A. She continued to be surprisingly important. Obviously, we get Vernon. Vernon, like, sort of replaces her. Tien sort of replaces her. But she was good in 2-1, 2-1X, 2-2. Yeah, I like Osane in A. Maybe it's a little bit high for her. Yeah, maybe she is just B, because we had to train her to get her to do all that stuff anyway. Her end of part 1 contributions were relevant, like extraordinarily so. Yeah, I think we leave her here. As for the people who have moved up, Ruslan, go ahead and slide on in there to S tier, where you belong. Lajos is definitely S tier, like, so much more of the game has gone by where he has been incredibly relevant for all of it. I think that this unit, obviously there's a couple of maps where I didn't deploy him, but the ones where I deployed him, he was like incredibly relevant, and there were quite a few of them. And factoring that in with his part 1, I think that he belongs up here in the S tier. Sarka, obviously, like, was always going to end up here. Like, she's better statted than Jay and Saline in some ways, and around for so much longer than them. It's crazy. So Sarka was always going to end up here. I think she's probably the most impactful person in Storch's army, in Zero Growths in general. Yeah, Sarka was always going to end up here. Hollis, I think, goes up. Hollis is just incredibly reliable as a bulky unit. He's my bulkiest unit. He's just incredibly reliable. I think he goes up here in A tier. Duck, I think it's a B tier performance. Just slightly less bulky than Hollis. More movement. He trades the 1 point of movement, which is definitely good. For swords, he doesn't have swords, and he doesn't have as much bulk as Hollis does. Pursuit is nice. A little bit of speed difference there in terms of that, but I think I prefer Hollis. I think that there is a tier gap between these units. I am not moving Titus down because the staff utility and the promotion getting him to the point where he can do stuff like that, I think keeps him around here. Helga, I'm also not moving up. I kind of expected to move her up, honestly, but her combat fall off faster than I thought it would. And granted, like, it's pretty close combat to Ruslan's, and they're both serviceable, right? They're both serviceable, but the thing is, if you're only serviceable, I don't think you're in S tier, unless, like Ruslan, you have that utility of being the flying repo bot. Like, there's so many things that Ruslan can do that no other unit can do. So I think he's here. Looking at this, I might move... No, this seems right. I think recency bias wants me to put Duck higher than these 4. And maybe he's more... No, Dewey did a lot in part 1 in terms of just, like, being our second staffer and being on a horse. Prior to getting, like, Tien and promoted Titus and Vernon. Dewey was just sort of the go-to second staffer. Even in part of part 2, she was the go-to second staffer. I think she belongs here. I think she stays here. Honeydew... I think Honeydew honestly stays where she's at as well. She was quite solid for the end of part 1. And halfway serviceable for... Actually, not that long in part 2. Like, I used her in her Gaiden. I don't even remember if I used her in 2-2. I used her in 2-1, but her performance didn't thrill me. Yeah, I think she stays where she's at. I kind of expected her to rise, but she doesn't. Okay, now for the new units. And yeah, just looking over everyone, making sure that no one looks out of place. It's possible that Larissa's a little bit too high. I do think that she was incredibly important in that early game portion. And obviously got replaced by Hollis, got replaced by Titus, got replaced by a lot of units, but like, I didn't have anyone who could take hits for a significant amount of time. And then when people weren't able to dish out hits, she got Father's Love, which allowed her to be one of the few units that could actually dish out hits too. Like, she was one of the few units. She basically dished out hits on a similar level to Gunner, but could take them much better and was around for longer. And I think that puts her here. Yeah, I think that puts her here. I don't think I'm overrating Titus either, just because of the staff utility stuff. Lara might be too high. This might be my bias because I really like her. How much was she actually doing in those early few chapters? I feel like actually not that much because her starting magic's pretty bad. We used most of her personal tome. If Arcady is F, Lara's probably F as well, which is unfortunate. Because Arcady's mostly F because I don't like him. But he also felt like he was the weakest of the Chapter 1 units. Which is how I feel about him in Vanilla too. Yeah, this looks better. This looks better. Okay. On to the new folks. Tien. I'm not especially high on this unit in Vanilla, but I was pretty impressed by him. I don't know. I do. He found a couple of good uses for the healing voice breath of life thingy. And Seraphim against some of the Dark Mages in 2-4, which was a very big map. I'm going to bring up people's 2-4 performances a lot, because I think that is probably the hardest map in Part 2. It's a big difficulty spike before you get some of the sort of filler units like these guys. It's a big difficulty spike, and it remains difficult. And yes, you can just sort of like warp to the boss if you want to, but you're missing out on a lot of side objectives if you do that, and a lot of valuable ones like the boots. One thing about 2-4 that I didn't take advantage of is light ruins on some of the choke points. That could have made it easier for me. I thought about doing it, but ended up then forgetting when the time came. But I think even light ruins, like, people would just take different paths at that point. You can't light ruin every bridge, and also the light ruins wear out after a while. So I'm probably going to bring up 2-4 for a lot of, basically everyone up to Hankulani. Their 2-4 performance is a big deal. And Tien's was very big. Like, effective damage against those Dark Mages. He did a lot to the boss. I could have killed the boss without him, granted. But he did a lot to the boss. And he made that boss kill a lot easier, and probably is the reason that we were able to steal the gem with Dreyfus. I think that, combined with staff utility, combined with just like general mage utility, oh, that's Waluya, I think that pretty solidly earns him B tier, I want to say. The tiers are not ordered. I think he has a better performance than Osane. Probably worse than Titus, because I like Titus's bulk and leadership stars. And Titus is forced for a map as well. For a couple of maps, actually. He has desert movement, which is relevant for 2 maps. And he actually doubles things without Dire Thunder, which Titus often can't do. I might actually... Well, okay, so we're not just rating Titus's Part 2 performance. We are rating his Part 1 performance, which was a lot better than his Part 2, like combining those in with each other. I think Tien, overall, is probably a B tier in 0 growths. I think he's probably lower, probably C in a growths context, but that's not what we're doing here. This is 0 growths. Freya, okay, so... The unit that I let die cost me Endgame X, by the way, but I wasn't going to play that anyway. Spoilers. It's an Easter egg. I didn't especially want to do it. But Freya, I really don't like this unit. I can't pretend that she's not got good qualities, and some of those would have been potentially useful on 0 growths. She has Darting Blow, and with Warrior promotions, her offenses are actually pretty cracked. Combining Darting Blow with her, like, very good speed and passable strength. She'll double and, like, 1 round a lot of things. I just don't like her because that requires doing one of 2 things, right? You either train her to 15 to get the fighter skill, which is incredibly helpful for her, and she probably wants... Like, she feels like she's torn in 2 directions, right? Because you want... It's like Wrathful Blood or whatever. It's the Rinka skill, where when you're damaged, you deal more... Like, when you're below max HP, you deal more damage, right? She wants that. Both for long-term and short-term. Like, because her strength is not as good as you would like. And since she's doubling most things, especially on player phase, she wants Wrathful Blood or whatever. She wants... Like, it's plus 4 damage to her. Flat. However, the downside of that is then you have to use her as a fighter, and her fighter stats are kind of shit. Her fighter stats are not great. I do not like her unperformative performance. Now, you can train her in 2-1X. Probably not in 2-1, because you probably don't, like, recruit her until the map's almost over. You train her in 2-1X, train her in 2-2, potentially. Promote her in Time for the Desert. She's pretty serviceable for a few maps. She's going to be doing a lot of damage, even in 0 growths. I just don't like doing that for the Vengeful Blood, and I probably should have spent a seal on her if I wanted her to perform for me. But I actually only had exactly as many seals as I wanted for these guys. Which leads to the question of who would skip out on that seal, right? Not Honkulani, obviously. Not Naya, obviously. Probably not Mango. Mango made pretty good use of that seal. Probably not these guys. Definitely not Osane. Like, Osane's seal was huge. I'm really happy with that. Maybe one of the Wyverns, which would have to be Helga, but then Helga's combat in Part 1 was very good. Like, it's just a matter of... Anyone we take that seal away from, I guess one of the paladins could have just not been a paladin. It's probably the answer. But at the time, I wanted all of them promoted. And I do think it was helpful. I think that the extra movement, the extra stats on them really helps. I mean, Hanyan in particular, like, the Hell promotion pushed him over the edge, right? He did a lot. He did a lot. I don't think I hit the seals for Freya. I sort of had to choose between, like, Freya, Naya, Honkulani, Mango at the time. And she got the short end of the stick. And, like, it is probably unfair to her that she ends up here. But that's just sort of how it goes. I don't know how she would have performed if I did instant promote her, right? If I had found a seal somewhere, if I'd routed a seal, if I'd been able to, like, steal an extra steal from, like, that Berserker in Mango's map, maybe. Maybe she'd be higher. But as it stands, I think that of all the people to get seals, like, she was the one who's going to use it, leverage it the least. Be Like, she would probably be better long-term in Zero Growths than sealing, like, Osane. But Osane leveraged it so much because she was so helpful for those few maps where we didn't have a competent mage, right? And as an unpromoted unit, she's just F tier, I think. For the time that she shows up, like, just not worth having. Maybe she would have done better than the Paladins. In another timeline, we could find out. But as it stands, I think I stand by my choice in terms of where I allocated the seals. I think this whole squad, yes, they were easier maps, and yes, each individual probably contributed less. Well, I don't even know that that's the case, because, like, you know, they can take hits, right? She can't take hits. That's her problem. Well, it's one of many problems. Like, she wants to promote. She's torn in these two different directions. Wanted to promote, but wanted to get Vengeful Blood, and just, like, struggling to do both. Naya did quite well for us. I mean, you saw she was one-rounding with effective weapons, but still, one-rounding. Nomads, who she doubled, despite them being fast. Like, he's way down by the Skypiercer, but still, Nomads are fast. In endgame of Part 2. And there's a lot of effective weapons she can use, like Wing Clipper, Long Dao, Sambato, Armor Slayer, like Mage Killer. Lady Blade. She has the Duelist Blow, which normally in Vision Quest I prefer hitting hard as opposed to hitting twice. Because units are so frail, I would rather be able to kill or try to kill without taking a counter than double. I also think that I think that oftentimes enemies are fast enough that, like, hitting twice doesn't guarantee hitting twice, but hitting hard will always hit hard. Other than Armor Knights, which you use mages on anyway. So in Vision Quest, I prefer hitting hard to hitting twice. Like, it's one of the few games where, obviously, you prefer to do both, but if you have to choose, I prefer hitting hard. Because you can bonk someone without retaliation, potentially. If so, you can get, like, a 2-range to chip, and then you bonk without retaliation. Naya doubles, though, and, like, impressive amount of time, and hits quite hard if she's using effective weapons. And the fact that she can do both in Zero Growths, and granted, like normal mode, her performance at base is a little bit worse, but she also grows in hard mode. I think that this unit has pretty solidly been a sleeper A tier in the army. She might move down when we get Part 4. I should probably say, the positions of the Part 1 squad is pretty much set in stone now. I don't think that any of the people from Part 1 are going to move down. Like, for example, Storch might, because he's actually fielded. But, like, I don't think she moves down for Part 4, just for, like, missing some more, right? Like, we've kind of factored in already that they've missed more. Like, Marlin missed more, Zoya missed more. These guys are sort of solid now. It is only the Part 2s that could potentially change in Part 4. Is just sort of my approach to it, is like, yeah. But yeah, I feel like Naya is a sleeper A tier. She might be a little bit worse in Part 4, but if she holds up, like, she probably stays there. And even if she doesn't, like, I'll have to think about it. Part 2 is weird, because on the one hand, a lot of maps are easier, because there's the idea of, like, you know, you can train these replacement units and stuff. But the difficulty spike hits, and for Zero Growths, you don't have a lot of competent units. Like, in Zero Growths, people like the Part 1 squad haven't been growing, and so suddenly you really lean on these Part 2ers, and when you have a Part 2er who can actually do stuff, that is incredibly valuable. Dreyfus, how good is Thief utility in Part 2 is the question. Because Esper didn't do any Thief utility in Part 2, so it's all just the Part 2 Thief utility from Dreyfus. And I want to say, so he has Steel Plus, meaning that he could steal some weapons, but I don't think I actually did. And he got the seals. He got our seal economy to where it needed to be. But other than that, like, we missed a couple of gems, but we could have got them. I guess we do give him credit for everything that we bought in the secret shop with his money. And I think that's a B tier, because it's not like his combat is awful. It's just fine. His combat is not what lands him here, right? Like, it's fine, but it's only fine. Cashew is weird, right? Because, like, if I tell you in a vacuum, a unit contributes solidly for his join map where he's free and one other very hard map, that doesn't sound very good in a game that's 40 maps long, because I'm never fielding him again, right? It felt really good, because he's a fucking growths unit in 0 growths, contributing a lot in 2 maps, one of which is pretty hard. And contributing in a not a unique way. Lazarus could have done a lot of that stuff. But Lazarus can't be everywhere. Like, someone's got to shoot down flyers on the other side of the map, right? Ultimately, however, I think that 2 out of 40 maps is not a high enough metric to pull you out of F tier. Like, Arcady and Lara contribute for more than that. Their contributions, I think, are more valuable than Cashew's. Like, Cashew was better than them on the maps where he was contributing. So maybe there's our less... Cashew was pretty good on the maps he was contributing, right? Because he also has decent res, so countering mages. We did that with a few of the monks, but I just don't think being a solid contributor on 2 maps gets you out of F tier. And honestly, that might be a case for Zoya down to F as well. Okay, counterpoint though, actually. Lara and Arcady are barely contributing. Cashew is definitely contributing, right? Where does that land him? Like, what's more important? Barely contributing for a lot of maps, or I wouldn't say significantly, but like legitimately contributing for 2 maps. Like, he probably contributed more than Zoya, honestly, and it feels weird to put Zoya down to F, cause she did stuff on the tent map, she did stuff on 2 of the, like, the 2 last maps as well, killing her sister and then killing the guy who raised them, but nothing that stands out. And then I guess she was like, well, I didn't deploy her on 2-1. She did some stuff on 2-1X, I think, but that might be Bosco. Yeah, I think actually Cashew goes here. Again, these tiers are not ordered. I just sort of naturally put him above her because I was talking about him being better than her, but don't think that this is, like, specifically ordered. Like, Naya's not the bottom of A, that sort of deal. They're just sort of haphazardly placed. Vernon, quite good. Just sort of took over Osane's role. Did it better, or I guess the same, but in a harder portion of the game. But he's higher statted. Yeah, I think he basically just, like, became Osane grows a beard and transitions, Transmask Osane. He's Transmask Osane. They were doing the same thing, occasionally side by side. I think they were both deployed in 2-4. He did quite a bit in 2-4, actually. Like, he was sort of like one group's healer / mage. He helped Lajos out quite a bit. And then he was just, like, solid staff, like Physic, Warp, Rescue. A lot of rescuing in the Fitzpatrick map. Which also goes out to Tien, right? Like, they both get credit for that sort of contribution. Because they're both equally good Warp rescuers. Yeah, I think he was solid in the Mango map. Yeah, I like this. I like them. Hankulani. Now, this may surprise you, but I really like Hankulani. I know, I haven't mentioned it. I'm trying to decide if she goes in S tier. She's definitely in S tier by the end of the playthrough, right? Like, almost certainly. And so maybe it's not even worth debating whether her Part 2 performance was S or A, because this is just sort of feeling them out in terms of how they are performing in this current part. But the ultimate goal is to come up with a tier list that reflects the entirety of the playthrough. It's just a long game, and this felt like a more fun and dynamic way to do it, and also to help with, like, sort of remembering things more easily. With that in mind, I think she's gonna end up in S tier by the end of the playthrough. I think she probably did an S tier performance in Part 2 anyway, but it's not like this is going to be a mistake in the end product. You can argue that joining in 2-4 is pretty late, but she was, like, our best unit for every map. She was the best unit for every map. Arguably not, I guess, the ballista sort of kept her in check for a little bit, but even then we found stuff for her to do, right? She went inside, she went on her own side mission, and then she came back and helped out after the ballista was taken care of. And she often, like, she's the only unit I sort of trusted to go off and fuck off to her own areas on the map. She was our warp killer. And granted, like, you know, we rigged a crit to do that, but she has the stats to be able to, like, feasibly kill with a crit, which not everyone can. She's a flyer. She's the flyer she's the combat flyer that we gave boots to be able to crit kill things. Yeah, I think she belongs here. I think she belongs here, even if we're just talking about the playthrough so far, the 1-2. Mega serviceable, but, like, how many chapters was she really doing stuff in? 4 of them? Like, she was a shove bot, obviously, for endgame. She's definitely good combat. She didn't do anything in her join map. Like, she did a little, but she practically didn't. So 2-5X is probably the first map where she really contributed, despite the fact that I've been calling 2-5 the mango map. Like, it kind of isn't. It's just where she joins. In this playthrough, I think she can contribute in a growth context on that map when you're, like, able to send Storch there faster. Able to send Storch or Duck, I guess, faster. But for our purposes, we kind of had to hang back until the very end of the map to recruit her. Which is abnormal, but... So yeah, 2-5X, 2-6, 2-7. And she was never the best at any of them. Honestly, this feels kind of C tier. This feels kind of C tier. She might move up as she contributes in Part 4. But as it stands, I don't know. She's just sort of there, and, like, she was solid for 2-5X. Mostly because, like, that was before we got the squad, before we got the mid squad that's carrying us. She was solid for 2-5X, but, like, she just hasn't been around for much. And I don't think, other than even in 2-5X, like, obviously not Hungulani was better. Then I almost said Natsuko because she's right there, but Hungulani's obviously better. But, like, that's, if you're worse than Hungulani, like, you know, I guess maybe Sarka might have been better, depending on movement, combat, all that fun stuff. But yeah, Mango just sort of, like, too little, too late. It feels like. Yeah, I like her. I like her as that sort of, like, filler unit for the end of Part 2, but this honestly feels like where she belongs in Vanilla as well. Maybe even here in Vanilla, but, like, she's definitely not here. She's definitely not D tier in Zero Growths because, like, you want statted units all throughout the game, right? Like, you want statted units all throughout the game. These guys, like, how much are we penalizing them for not being fucking available at all? That's a good question. So, Mahanian... Let's start... I'm gonna skip this squad because they're weird to talk about. I'm gonna skip all... no, I'm not gonna. I want to figure out where they belong. I want to figure out where they belong. Because even though it is weird, it is important. I mean, important, quote unquote. It's a fucking Fire Emblem tier list, but... I think... 2 maps of combat... Like, I mean... Look, 2 maps of combat earned Cashew D tier, but Cashew was not nearly as good at combat as Mahinian was. I think Mahinian is C tier. I'm much more impressed by him than I am Mango. And it's a 1 map difference in terms of availability. I know I'm a stickler for availability, but is that enough to put him in the same tier with her? I think probably. Yeah, I think probably. I think all these people have been fine. Like C tier fine. They'll probably end up separated from each other once we get to part 4 and see like what's more useful. Fast pal, strong pal, or good all-around combat that's knockoff movement. But I think they're like here. They might move down in part 4. Who knows? Just those last 2 maps where we wanted some combat. Rakkus, I'm surprised because I thought he would be a lot more impressive, but like he just hasn't had the chance to do anything. Yeah, he just hasn't had the chance to do anything. Is really the issue. Cygnus. I mean, Cygnus is in the same boat as Rakkus, where like his combat sets are very good, but he did things in 1 map, right? So like, I anticipate that he'll move out of D tier, but he did things in 1 map. Like, he contributed less overall than Cashew, which is wild. But, you know, he'll exist in part 4, and he'll probably be important in part 4. He'll almost certainly be important in part 4. Like, we get the part 3 units, but we don't get a warrior in part 3. That's for damn sure. And Male. Male is very weird. Male is probably the weirdest unit here to try to rank, right? Because she was important for 2 warp skips. She was important for 2 warp skips, and that's kind of a big deal. How big a deal? Because, like, she didn't really do anything else. Like, she repoed a little bit, she healed a little bit. She did some combat in her join map, actually. She did some combat in her join map. And she is definitely going to be an important part 4 warper. However, only 2 warp skips. One of those was a 1 turn. And I do think that, like, clicking a button to win the map is a pretty big deal. It's only 1 map so far. I know that there will be warps in part 4. I have several of them routed, actually, already. But she's only done 1 of those so far. And then so the one in her join map, from the way things landed, she's the only one who could have warped. However, if I had moved Storch forward an additional square, then someone else could have warped. So I don't even know how much credit I give her for that. Being the +1 range warp rescuer, though, is a big deal, and it's come up. Well, it hasn't really, actually, because we could have simply rescued, we could have simply used Cygnus's turn to rescue one of the shove bots out of the way. I think it was Vernon who was in the way? Yeah, it was Vernon who was in the way. And then anyone with 5 range could have worked. I think she goes here. Like, it's just the same deal as these guys, right? Is like, they just haven't had a bunch of time to show off what they're capable of. There's just not been a bunch of time to contribute for these guys. Not Mango. I mean, Mango a little bit too. It's like 1 extra mat, but these guys in particular, like, there's not been a lot of time for them to settle in where they belong. And maybe that settling will bring them down. For Male, it definitely won't. For Rakkus, I'm thinking he'll probably move up, but we'll see, right? We'll see. Yeah, I think I like this. As a reminder, based on the way I rate availability, none of these guys are going to move when I rate the Part 3 units. So this is how they are locked in for their Part 1 and 2 performances. And the people who joined in Part 1 and just sort of didn't contribute in Part 2 are also basically locked in. Like, anyone who never got deployed in Part 2 is locked in unless for some reason I deploy them in Part 4, right? Like, I do have Hunkulani ready for promotion. If we need a 5th flyer for a skip of some sort, not Hunkulani, Natsuko, I have her ready for promotion. In fact, she might be moving down. Let me think about Natsuko, actually. She did a fair amount that only Flight could give you in the early game. Yeah, she did a fair amount that only Flight can... I mean, like, did she? Yeah. Everything up until 1-8. 1-8 is where you rescue Lajos. Even in 1-8, she did stuff, right? So in between all of those, like, Flight is useful, whether it's for rescue drops, whether it's for, like, just flying ship combat stuff. I think that she still belongs here. I think that this is good for her. You know, Part 1 is hard, and she contributed in Part 1. Which is good for her. Good for her. Anyway, again, let me know what you think of this versus just a single tier list at the end. I think for a game and playthrough as long as Vision Quest, I like this format better because it lets me sort of solidify thoughts on people's performances as they're performing in this point in the playthrough. In a more traditional playthrough where, like, you do often have units that stick around for the entire time, as opposed to 0% growths where you are cycling through units, then, you know, obviously a single tier list video at the end seems more appropriate for that. But, like, let's be honest, at the end of Part 4, I would not remember anything about, like, how Vageless contributed in Part 1, or, like, you know, even the contributions of, like, Osane or anyone, right? Like, a little bit later, but still much, much earlier, because it's just such a long game. Yeah. Let me know if you like this, and if you do like it, also go ahead and click like. It helps out a lot. And subscribe if you want to see more. Alright, bye! Thanks for watching.